tonight Mr. Ralph Martiri, if I'm not mispronouncing that. He's the Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, because I keep reversing those words.
You need taxes before you can have a budget. Taxes come first.
Depends on which politician you're talking to, I suppose. But he's going to talk about the Illinois state budget, some of the pension issues which are driving a lot of the Illinois state budget, as well as some of the possible solutions to the budget issues, including, I believe, the fair tax amendment that this can be voted on in next November. Without further ado, Mr. Ralph Martiri.
All right, so good evening. Are you all familiar with the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability? You ever heard of us before? Okay, you have. Okay, so we're bipartisan. We're not nonpartisan. So my board of directors doesn't really like or trust each other at all. And that's great for us at the staff level because it lets us focus on best practices and data. And that's what we're all about. We're about solving problems in a way that promotes social and economic justice and comports with the evidence of what actually works. Okay, that's how we go about our business. We don't really get very ideological. So pension funding is what I was asked to talk about. And you can't just talk about that in a vacuum, because if you do, you can't identify what really caused the problem, and you can't really talk about what will rationally solve the problem. So we have to put our pension systems in context of the state's fiscal system. This is the magic picture. This is why. So for Illinois, fill in the blank. This is why Illinois underfunds K-12 education. This is why Illinois underfunded the pensions. This is why your property taxes are too high. This is why. Now, it's the only piece of modeling, really complex modeling, I've included in the presentation, and there's a reason for that. Anybody here with a stats background? Anybody know what statistics are? Okay, we have one guy, so great. Right. But if you do anything with statistics, you know your assumptions can jury-rig your outcomes, right? You can make a model dance to almost any tune you want it to dance to. So we try to stay away from complex modeling, and we try to do simple math with publicly available data sets so you can check our work. But when you're projecting forward, you have to have a model. And this is a projection forward of whether the state's current mix of tax revenues will continue to support its current spending levels on services, plus pay off its existing debt. This model, by the way, we've been using now for over 16 years. It's been peer-reviewed by 4 different independent PhD economists, including the head of state and local tax at the GAO in Washington, D.C., and with it, we've accurately predicted the growth of the state's deficit within 1% every single year, except those years they changed law. I can't predict a change in law, so the model can't predict a change in law. What are the assumptions? The assumptions are real simple. Start with a balanced budget. So if we had a balanced budget in fiscal year 2019, we did not, but if we did, would revenue growth sustain current level of services, adjusting just for historic rates of changes in inflation and population, and assuming a normal economy, assuming no changes in law? The yellow line is the cost of continuing current public services into the future, plus paying off our debt. That we don't, modify for anything. We know what the debt payments are, we throw them in the model. It's a cost. The red line is our projected revenue growth. The gap between revenue growth and cost growth is a structural deficit. Illinois has had one of these since the late 60s, early 70s. And these things, structural deficits, are really hard. I hope I don't offend any politicians in the room. Just to be really clear, I'm a politician too. I'm currently a member of the school board in Oak Park River Forest High School. Before that, I was the president of a feeder district school board. So if I make fun of politicians, I'm also making fun of me. So it's not anything I'm taking hope no one takes personal in the room. But structural deficits are really hard for politicians to deal with for 2 reasons. The only way to actually sustainably solve the problem is to increase taxes up to your revenue, up to your cost line, right? I don't know if you know this, but tax increases are politically difficult to do. True. No, it's really true. I'm glad you're all seated for that. Or cut your spending on services down to your revenue line, or some combination thereof. Now, cutting our expenditures down to our revenue line, we've been cutting expenditures, but slowly and incrementally over time. Why? Because of how we spend our money. This is how we spend our money. And politicians aren't going to just hack what we spend our money on, because it's another way to get unreelected. So here's the general fund budget for fiscal year 2020. We're going to spend $40 billion this year. I break the spending down into two components, hard costs. And what do I mean by hard costs? These are things they either have to pay by law or by contract. So there's no discretion. It's a hard cost. And there's 13 billion of them. And you can see debt service to third parties like banks and bondholders, the pension contribution, which is part of a continuing appropriation in a statute. So it's a hard cost. They have to pay by law. There are other appropriations that they have to pay by law in a statute of $449 million, not a lot. And then group health insurance on state workers, a contractual obligation they can't get out. So there's 13 billion of the 40 billion spent. Nobody votes on anything. There's a statute or a contract, and they spend the money. Then there's the appropriations where they have some discretion. These are your current services. And you can see there's two totals there. A gross total at line 3 of 28 billion. If you go down, they're only going to actually spend 27 billion. Why? There's almost always a line in the state budget for something called unspent appropriations. It means this is their target spending, but it's not actually going to end up being their final spending for these line items. They're going to, in fact, reduce spending by $973 million over the course of the year. We just don't know what's going to get cut yet. Okay? So how do they spend the money? 97%, so 97 cents out of every tax dollar goes to four things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. Now, education has three components to it. It has early childhood, K-12, and higher ed, but it's all education. And that's why it's so hard to just cut yourself down to your revenue line. What do you have to cut? Well, if 97 cents out of every dollar goes to education, health, social services, and public safety, you have to cut education, healthcare. And those aren't politically popular things to cut, which is why you get rhetoric from the political establishment rather than reality when it comes to your budget. Who's heard things like, well, we should solve problems with across-the-board cuts? You hear that all the time? Why? They don't want you to know what the board is. They don't want you to know that it's cutting education, et cetera, et cetera. And you know why I know that? Polling data. So Southern Illinois has a institute that does every 2 or 3 years attitudes of the electorate towards different things. And one year we actually got to add some questions to their polling data. And so the question one, this was under Rod Blagojevich, the paradigm of good government. You know, I served on his transition team, and I leave that on my resume because I think I'm the only one that hasn't had to wear a wire for the feds that actually served on his transition team. That's okay. So in Ron Blagojevich at the time, we had an accumulated deficit of $5 billion. And so the question we put out to the voting public, a non-push, we wanted to get real attitudes, was we have a $5 billion deficit. Question one. Should the state solve that problem by cutting spending or raising taxes? What do you think most people said? Cut spending, of course. We had about 64% of the states say cut spending. About 25% said raise taxes. They're all the liberals that live on the lakefront. You could tax their dreams, too, if it's for the poor, starving children. That's fine. So they were supporting a tax increase in the blank. And the rest of the state was undecided, which I thought was kind of amazing. How could you be undecided on such a simple question? But whatever. For those who then answered cut spending, we said, here it is. Here's the state's budget. Pick your $5 billion in cuts. Or you could change your vote to say raise taxes. And we went from 63% or so of the state saying cut spending to almost 70% of the state saying raise taxes. Because individually, each of these items are supported at a higher level than people fear tax increases. Politicians know that. So when you have this structural deficit, it's really hard for a political system to deal with. And if they're not going to deal with it, what you'll get is what we've gotten, and you'll get the information on that through this presentation, is sort of incremental cuts to spending over time that people don't really see in one big lump. They're cutting consistently. And two other things. Thing one, shift the responsibility for something the state is supposed to fund down to the local government. What do you think they did with that? What area did they shift funding from the state to local governments? Education. I'll give you all the data on that. So that's one thing they did. It's why they did it. It's why they did it. They had a structural deficit. They couldn't afford the same level of services from one year to the next. They had the power to shift this cost down to the local level, so they did it. It's that military term for what flows downhill. Exactly. Number two, find some long-term obligation and just underfund it. And divert the money you should have put into this longer-term obligations to instead hide part of your structural deficit. And then write an IOU to this long-term obligation, let it bear interest, and let somebody else have to deal with it in the far distant future when you are dead. And you are dead as an elected official when you're out of office. So you try to kick it down the road to when you no longer would have to deal with it logically, right? What do you think they picked? I heard it. Pensions. So when I said the structural deficit is why, you could really see in a political system the pressure this creates to do irresponsible things just to get through your budget year. Because what a political system does reward is short-term. Get through this budget year, this election cycle. What a political system does not reward is sort of putting a painful option on the table now that bears benefits down the road. Long-term stuff is really hard for politically oriented systems to get right. It's just the truth. So here's how we spend our money. Other, by the way, 3% of the budget, other. Everything else state government does. Economic development, environmental protection, the parks, central management services. And probably my favorite category, and I really think I'm pushing for them to just have a line item for this in the budget, waste, fraud, and abuse, right? Don't you think this is Illinois, we should just have a line item, let's agree we're gonna waste, fraud, and abuse, 100 million this year and dole it out to cronies and stuff and be done. But no, I point that out because another piece of rhetoric that's been counterproductive, and it's used by the political system to stop taxpayers from pushing for tax increases because it's hard for a politician to vote for those, is, well, I might support more revenue, but first we got to eliminate all waste, fraud, and abuse. Well, who doesn't that sound good to? Of course, it's a bad idea to waste, fraud, and abuse public money. We should not do it. Does it happen? Yes. Anytime people get together to spend billions, some of that will be wasted, frauded, and abused. I guarantee it. And I know that. So before I started working at a think tank, right, doing good government public policy, I don't know if you know my background, I was a business attorney. I was a partner at a law firm. I was chair of our mergers and acquisitions, structured finance, and intellectual property groups. I was, in fact, an evil corporate lawyer and good at it. Let me thank you very much. So proud of my past. And I did not represent the little guy. I want to tell you that. I was at a big law firm. I was representing Fortune 5 companies, banks, hedge funds, all the evildoers in this world. And I don't know one of them that didn't have waste, fraud, and abuse. And the bigger the company, the more it was a problem. So should we tolerate waste, fraud, and abuse as taxpayers? Of course not. Should our standard be the impossible? You have to eliminate all of this before we could do what we really need to do, solve problems? No. No, of course not. And especially when you look at where most of that waste, fraud, and abuse, if not all of it, is hidden. Less than 3% of the budget. And some of it we need to spend. We need to spend some money on environmental protection. We need to spend some money on the parks. We need central management services, right? So if we were at who's the group? The RAND Corporation. You're all familiar with them, big think tank on the West Coast. They do great stuff. A number of years back, they did a study that said if the public sector could be as efficient as possible, eliminate duplicative agencies and waste and all that other stuff, you would find a savings of between 1.5% and 2.5% of your budgets. Okay. Keep that number in mind when we start talking about the state's finances. So I told you that the structural deficit model started with the assumption that we had a balanced budget. I also told you we do not. Here is the state's actual fiscal condition as it exists today, fiscal year 2020. Revenue projection for this year, it's at $40.2 billion, which sounds good. Remember, they're going to spend $40.2 billion, so that sounds like we're in balance, right? Good. So let's take out those hard costs, $13 billion. Net revenue is 27. Again, sounds good because after unspent approach, they're going to spend 27 billion net this year. We'll take that revenue line down to the second. So there's our remaining revenue after hard costs, 27 billion. Now, here's what they don't tell you, and they don't have to. So there's no accounting requisite that forces the public sector to tell you anything about its accumulated carry forward deficit from the prior year. That's the fiscal way of saying unpaid bills left over, $7.7 billion. Now, by law, they got to pay that $7.7 billion off within a fiscal year. So any carry forward deficit, accumulated deficit of unpaid bills from a prior fiscal year becomes a charge on your current revenue in the next fiscal year. It just does. You have to pay it off. So let's take that out. That leaves $19.4 billion in revenue. They are going to spend $27 billion. The deficit will decrease a little bit, 170, 180 million or 200 million or so, whatever, but it still stays at 7.5 billion, or 28% of what we are going to spend this year on education, health, social services, and public safety is deficit spending. That's the data. You may not like math or statistics, but you probably all can recognize a 28% operating deficit is not a sustainable position, right? We are not in good fiscal health. And as the structural deficit model told you, without changes in law, that deficit is going to grow. The reason they cut it a little this year was some changes in law. They raised some revenue and some one-timers and some small tax increases and blah, blah, blah. That's how they were able to cut it down a little bit. All right. So if you're going to solve a structural deficit problem, you got to look at both the revenue and the spending side to see what's your driver. A lot of the, once again, the talking heads in the media, a lot of the rhetoric, it's all wasteful, out of control spending, Springfield, drunken sailors, blah, 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 blah. There's never been any data to support the contention that spending on services is a driver of our deficit. It, in fact, is not. So here is the state's own numbers, nominal dollars, spending on all those services, the stuff that aren't hard costs, right, that second area, from fiscal year 2009, which is the end of the Great Recession, till today. The end of the Great Recession, we spent $27.5 billion on all that stuff. This year, we're going to spend 27.1, 400 million less in nominal dollars, not adjusting for inflation. So you can see a crazy ramp up in spending on services is the driver of the deficit, right? No, it's never been that way. In fact, you should adjust for inflation to get a real comparison. And I thought we would just give you a longer view. So these are the kind of slides we love at the CTBA because it's just nothing but numbers. Right? Very sexy. Far left-hand column. That is our fiscal year 2000 budget under Governor Ryan. And I left other out just because no one cares about it, but it's included in the total line at the bottom. So there's our spending, K-12, early childhood, higher ed, blah, 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 in the year 2000. That's that column. The second column, what would we have to be spending this year to make the same purchases we made that year after inflation? Because inflation drives up the cost of everything over time, right? A dollar buys less in year 3 than it bought in year 1 because of inflation. So that second column is the inflation adjustment, that's all. If we were going to stay equal with 2000, what would we be spending in 2020? The third column is the 2020 enacted budget. Now remember, this is gross appropriations. This is going to overstate spending by $973 million because there's that unspent appropriations line that I can't apply yet because they haven't applied it yet. So while these expenditures look like what they are here, this is the best I could give you. This is gross. They're going to be less by $973 million somewhere. I can't tell you where. The fourth line is the difference in dollars. The fifth line is the percentage change. So walking through this, K-12 education in real terms, we will be spending 7.9% more on it in the year 2020 than we did in the year 2000. Good. I've been doing this. CTBA was actually formed in the year 2000. That's when we started working. This is the first year between now and then that there's been real growth in K-12 funding. So if I was making this presentation last year, that would still be a negative number. The reason we've finally gotten to the point of real growth is the new school funding formula that passed a couple of years ago, the evidence-based formula. That requires the state to increase K-12 funding over the prior year by at least 300 to 350 million every year. So because of that requirement, we are now 3 years into the bill, and the projected spending this year finally puts us over. But it's not a huge increase. It's 8% over 20 years. It's a quarter of a point per year. Woo-hoo. All right. Early childhood, that's up a lot, 81%. Now, most of that growth actually happened during the Rauner administration, believe it or not. And apparently, and this is just a rumor, I don't know if it's true, there was a well-placed lobbyist for early childhood during the Rauner administration. Her name was Diana Rauner, the governor's wife, who worked at the Ounce of Prevention, an early childhood advocacy group. So anything you want to say about Governor Rauner, at least he listened to his wife. So that's a good thing. And it's a good thing to increase that investment. I mean, all the science shows that this pays taxpayers back tenfold for making the investment in early childhood. So the good news is we've made a greater investment. The bad news is we're not meeting need. So even at $544 million, which is the current state appropriation for early childhood, we're short of meeting state need by about $2.5 billion. So good, we've increased it. We got a little ways to go to meet actual demographically driven need. Everything else is cut. And in fact, total expenditures are cut. We're going to spend less overall after inflation on education, health, social services, and public safety this year than we did 2 decades ago. Higher ed, special case. Ignore inflation. Higher ed received a state appropriation of $2.1 billion in the year 2000. It's going to receive an appropriation of $1.9 this year. That's less than nominal dollars, not even adjusting for inflation. What has that meant? Well, let's get back to Rod Blagojevich. So we started cutting higher ed expenditures in 03 and 04 under Rod Blagojevich because if it could be done wrong, Rod sort of sought it out and did it. So that was one of his policies. In 2002, the year before we started really cutting higher ed expenditures at the state level or appropriations, state appropriations for higher ed covered over 70% of the cost of a student attending a public university in Illinois. And tuitions and fees covered about 27, 28%. After all these cuts, those numbers have flipped. And now tuition is covering over 70%, and state appropriations are down in the 20s. Our growth in tuition costs for attending public universities and community colleges has outstripped the national growth over this period by over 50 percentage points. So there are consequences, right, to underfunding public services. And, you know, I don't even want to get into the human services line, maybe a little bit. I mean, there are no longer any domestic violence prevention centers in Marion, Illinois. None. They're all closed because of budget cuts. Not because of lack of need, because of budget cuts. And I highlight that because of the idiocy of what these short-term cuts do from a long-term cost standpoint. I'm going to highlight domestic violence because it's an easy one to highlight. So we cut these things, which for about $6,000, $6,500 per violent person, helps keep that person from doing violent acts at home. Now that money's gone, center's gone, these folks aren't less violent. So eventually they're going to become abusive to their girlfriends, their spouses, whatever, badly, right? Some of them so abusive, they're going to have to go to jail for beating the heck out of their spouse. Now we are going to spend $40,000 to $45,000 a year to incarcerate this person, rather than the $6,000 to $6,500 to keep him from being violent. Oh, but wait, there's more. The family's lost his income, so they may need additional support. Certainly, whoever got abused is going to need some sort of supports. And how about if there were kids at home watching it? So the budget cut, and it was really literally a budget cut. It was all because of budgetary reasons. For that, what's it ultimately going to cost taxpayers? And the answer is a lot more. And you could go down the line in human services. We've really messed up our safety net in Illinois. The framework, the infrastructure has deteriorated substantially because of cuts, and it'll take a while to rebuild it, if we in fact rebuild it. So I told you these political impacts. So I said one is you're going to shift the cost from the state level down to the local level when you have a structural deficit to hide part of it. Another is you're going to borrow against a long-term obligation and take the money that should have gone to that long-term obligation to spend on current services and write an IOU that bears interest, okay, pension. But then other things, I love this one. Pin the blame on the system for failures. So education, I like to highlight this one. Everyone, why should we give more money to this broken system? We're getting terrible outcomes. No one asked the capacity question. No one said, does it have the capacity to generate the outcomes we want? And if you don't ask that capacity question, you're going to get false negatives. So it's very easy to blame a system as failing when in fact it's just underfunded to perform at the level you expect, right? I mean, and that's really one of the very caustic things in the political environment that arises out of fiscal problems. And frankly, it's repeated by both parties. This is a bipartisan thing, to blame the system, and then people lose faith in public structures. And then, you know, if the responsible thing to do is actually raise more tax revenue, you're not going to be able to do it, because now everyone's saying, well, the system's broken. Why should I pay more in taxes to fund this broken system? It becomes a spiraling negative that really gets taken advantage of in the public sector from a rhetorical standpoint. So let's give you some of the numbers to flush out what the state's actually done to hide its structural deficit. I said one thing it did was shift the cost of funding education from the state down to the local level. So this compares Illinois to the rest of the nation. Illinois is in the blue, the rest of the nation on average is in red. On average, local property taxes in the state pay for 45% of K-12 education. In Illinois, they cover almost 67%. On average, state tax revenue covers 46.5% of the cost of public education in a state. In our state tax revenue only covers 25%. And in case you're wondering, we are the outlier on both sides of this equation. And so we're first in the nation in reliance on property taxes to fund schools, and 50th in reliance on state-based tax revenue. So that has some consequences, right? Consequence number one, we've tied the quality of public education a kid gets in Illinois to the property wealth of the community in which the kid lives. So that, by definition, has to be inequitable, right? And you don't believe it. So I told you that before I joined the school board at Oak Park High School, I was in the feeder district, River Forest District 90. Anybody here know about River Forest? I think we might actually have a zoning ordinance against poverty. I mean, we don't, there are very few low-income folks in River Forest, Illinois, kind of a tawny community. 3 of my 4 schools were national blue ribbon, and the other one isn't, only because it has such a high special needs population. We can't meet the testing criteria. Now, it has a high special needs population because people with special needs kids move into our community because we give their kids whatever they need. An example is the last year I was president of the board, so that was just a year ago, we spent over $1 million in River Forest on transportation services for 5 special needs children. But we got them what they needed and where they needed to go, and with appropriate supports in the vehicle transporting, okay? Cost us $1 million. You take one step out of River Forest, you're in, our neighboring communities are Maywood, Austin, Bellwood. You think their schools look like my schools? Okay, so that's what you get when you over-rely on local property taxes. And a real clear example is in a community like River Forest, where you can just literally step outside of the community and see what it does. The other thing, though, is it's a lousy way to tax people. So all we did was take out the impact of inflation, so this is in real terms, and we plotted out the growth in property taxes in Illinois versus the growth in median income. So from 1990 to 2016, the last year I final data for on property taxes grew by 62% after inflation in real terms, while median income grew by 5.5% after inflation. So property taxes are growing at more than 10 times the rate of growth of income for most people. That's not a good thing. That is a bad thing, right? We have this bad thing because of that structural deficit. And because of that structural deficit, the state didn't have enough money to fund education adequately from state-based resources. So the state kicked that obligation down to local property taxes, and our local property taxes are then ballooning out of control because of the state's failure to fund education adequately from state resources. I told you that model explained a lot. It really does. So that's a lousy way to tax people. It's a lousy way to tax businesses. Yeah, I hear it all the time. Oh, we just need to cut the business income taxes and jobs will grow. Well, first off, that's a bald-faced lie, and we'll get into that later on. But secondly, income taxes aren't the taxes businesses pay. The number one tax they pay? Property taxes. 49% of total business tax burden in Illinois is property taxes, almost half. Income taxes that they actually pay out of their own pocket is roughly 7% of their tax burden. Flow-through income taxes, for those of you that have S-corps or limited liability companies or partnerships, are 4%. Where's the tax burden really? And it's because of this. What's really outrageous about this, just to show you how aggressively Illinois has pushed this cost down to the local level. So we are a big and rich state. I don't know if you know that. We have the 5th largest economy of any state in America, $888 billion state GDP, by the way, $880 billion. And we have the 6th largest population. Our total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income, however, we rank 27th in the country, bottom half. And what is that figure? It's every tax and every fee charged by any unit of state or local government in our state. Take out the total revenue raised, whether it was through a tax or a fee to support any public service, divide that by your personal income, you get a tax burden compared to all that in every other state. However, so we're low tax. When you isolate the property tax, that one tax, we're always in the top 3 to 5 in the nation. So despite being very low tax overall, we're very high tax on the property tax. And so we've got to fix this sustainably. We got to stop driving this up. This is very hard for people on fixed incomes, or even, frankly, even in the workforce. You can't have a property tax burden growing at 10 times the rate of growth in your income and stay in that house for too long. I mean, it's just a hard thing. We can't solve this problem unless the state gets adequate revenue to fund schools, because that's where this money is mostly going. So that's the challenge, right? So now, I mentioned this school funding formula a couple times, and I'm just going to admit I'm a big fan of it, and there's a reason for that. I co-wrote it. So I co-wrote this legislation with a guy named Mike Jacoby, who's one of the heads of the Management Alliance. So you could say I'm a little pregnant with the legislation or whatever, so I'm a big champion. So I just want you to know that. I don't want to make it sound like I'm puffing up here without giving you the full disclosure. But the evidence-based funding formula radically changed how the state of Illinois funds K-12 education. Our old formula was a foundation formula. So what happened? The General Assembly and the governor would set a dollar amount per pupil, the foundation level. And this dollar amount per kid would be funded by some combination of state and local taxes. And it's the same for every kid, no matter where you are in the state. Our foundation level was based on nothing. It wasn't based on one cost of educating children. It was a number predicated on what state decision makers felt they could afford, given how the formula operated in their fiscal condition. So what do you think how adequate that number was? It was a lousy, low, inadequate number. The evidence-based model completely changes this. And so what it does is it has identified, and this was research done at the University of Wisconsin and USC over 30 years, they identified those educational practices which over time had a statistically meaningful correlation to improving student achievement. What works? And they identify them. They're all in statute. And then they say, all right, we're going to fund these for your school district based on your unique student population. And what do I mean by that? So if two school districts are right next to each other and they have the same enrollment, the exact same number of kids, but school district A over here has a lot more low-income kids than school district B, school district A gets a lot more money. Because all the research shows to get equal academic outcomes, the cost of implementing these evidence-based practices is higher in areas with concentrated low-income kids, concentrated English language learners, significant special needs populations, okay? So it automatically adjusts, and it comes up with a target amount of funding for every school district based on its unique student population, rather than some crazy one number for every kid in the state, whether you lived in Barrington or East St. Louis, right? It's a silly idea. Different needs in Barrington and East St. Louis. Trust me on that. It's true. So it's a really good formula. But it also lets us know how we're doing. So the first time the formula was run was fiscal year 2018. And in that year, this was still Governor Rauner was in office. His state board of education said, gee, when you add up the adequacy targets for every school district they're supposed to have based on the evidence, and you add up total school funding in our state, we're short by $7.3 billion. $7.3 billion. It's a big number. We only put $8 billion into K-12 from the state. We nearly have to double the state investment. So we're way short. Because we knew we'd be short, we didn't know we'd be that short, but we knew we'd be short when we worked with the legislators on the bill. So I worked on the model itself, getting that right. But the political process was, all right, we want to ensure that we increase school funding every year because we know we're going to be short. We want to grow our way to actually fund the model. That was the thought process. So that's where you get the first thing up there. K funding has to increase every year by somewhere between 300 to 350 million over the prior year. The reason there's a range, there's a $50 million property tax relief fund in the bill that school districts can apply for and then give that property tax relief to their taxpayers. So if any of that 50 million isn't claimed, it goes into this minimum amount. But the second thing they said is we don't want to lose generations of children to an underfunded system, and we are woefully underfunded. So we want this model fully paid for on an inflation-adjusted basis in real terms within 10 years. So 10 years from 2018 is 2028. Those are the funding pressures that this legislation created for the state's fiscal system. Here's the problem. Even if the state puts in the full $350 million every year, it will take till fiscal year 2047 to fully fund the model on an inflation-adjusted basis. It's 29 years, not quite what they had in mind. To get it funded within 10 years, the minimum growth has to be $843 million a year, more than double what we're putting in now. Now we have a structural deficit, so our current fiscal resources won't allow that. But I'm giving you this because I'm trying to put everything in context here, right? And this is a rational demand on future revenue given how woefully underfunded our school system is. So we've created a little bit of fiscal pressure with our school funding system. Now let's talk about the pensions. So we have a defined benefit system. And with a defined benefit system, it's actually pretty easy to have a solvent one if you're fiscally disciplined. So there's the problem with Illinois. The fiscal discipline part didn't exist. But actuaries determine what it would cost over a 30-year period every year to fully fund the benefits that members of the system are earning over that 30-year period. And they look at things like how long people stay in a job, their rate of pay, retirement rate, disability rate, death rates, all that stuff, right? They come up with what's called the normal cost. And if you put in that normal cost every single year, your pensions are fully funded. You don't even have to be fully funded to be healthy as a pension system. You only, according to the Congressional Budget Office, and they're right, we agree with them, you only ever need to be 80% funded. Why? All your state workers, in the case of the state, don't retire on the same day. And you go to 0 workers. You never need 100% funding, ever, never in the public sector. You might need it in the private sector. Your business could go out of business. And so you need to be 100% funded. So when people say, well, we should do it just like the private sector, no, we really shouldn't, because we'll be, what's the word I want to use that's polite for polite company? Urinating away money on debt service that we should in fact be using for current services, or overtaxing ourselves to pay debt service needlessly. Either of those is a bad idea, right? So let's not do it. So anyway, they just weren't bothering to fund that normal cost number for generations. Instead of putting that in, they just said, we know we owe it. Here's an IOU to the pension systems. Let that bear interest, which compounds annually every year. And we'll take the money that should have gone to normal cost and instead use it to hide our structural deficit. Now, it's a venerable practice to do that in the state of Illinois. The first time they established a pension commission to deal with our woefully underfunded systems in Illinois was 1913. So we know how to underfund pensions in this state. We get it. We get how to do it. But they were doing it aggressively in the late 80s and early 90s. So much so, a massive growth. So they had an unfunded liability in 1994 of $17 billion. It's now almost 140, by the way, just the good old days. But that was double the unfunded liability it was just 5 years earlier. That's how aggressively they were underfunding the systems. And our funded ratio at this point was only 54%. So we only had 54% of the assets we should have had, not 100%, not the 80% that CBO thought we should have. So Governor Edgar got together with Speaker Madigan, who, yes, has lived forever and has been in the state General Assembly since we've had one. At least it seems that way to me. Got together and passed the pension ramp. And the pension ramp said, okay, became effective in 1995, and it said, we're creating a 50-year payment plan. That was the ramp. And if we make all these payments that are identified in the statute over the next 50 years, then by the year 2045, 50 years from 1995, by the year 2045, we'll be 90% funded. Healthy. We're only 54% funded today. That's a good thing, right? Right. Okay, so now picture that structural deficit. So here's your costs, here's your revenue. So when you create a new payment plan that you didn't have before, that moves your cost line up over time, correct? Right? Created a new mandatory statutory payment obligation. And they didn't pass a nickel of revenue to fund it. So how does that help your, no, that actually makes your structural deficit a lot worse. And they knew it. Bless you. How do I know they knew it? For the first 15 years of that pension ramp, they'd simply by law continued the practice of underfunding the pensions. They intentionally grew the unfunded liability for 15 years. Now it's called the ramp because what they did was little tiny payments that didn't even come up to normal cost for 15 years, and then whoop, ski slope, way backloaded. And that's why it's called the pension ramp. So here are the dollar amounts attributable to different factors that have grown the unfunded liability between 1996, when the pension ramp was being implemented, and 2018. Now, over this period of time, it grew from $17 billion to $135 billion. It was about $132 billion this year. Salaries saved us $5 billion. How? Headcount. We have so many fewer state workers today than we did in the 90s. It's not even funny. When you compare Illinois to the rest of the country, our headcount per capita is always 49th or 50th. So we have a very low number of state workers. Benefit increases, oh boy, $6 billion. That's it. $6 billion of the growth from 17 to 132 was because of benefits. Changes in actuarial assumptions, $32 billion. That's a bigger one. Now, some of these are, changes in mortuary tables, changes in all those kinds of things. But the biggest one is the change in what's called the discount rate. What is that? The discount rate is set by statute, and it's just the interest that unfunded liability bears and/or the rate of return they expect the assets to generate. It's one and the same thing. So our discount rate, the rate of return on our assets we expected, used to be between 8 and 8.5%. Now they cut it down to between 6.75 and 7.5%. Now think about what that does. We have hundreds of billions of dollars of assets in these pension systems. They used to assume they were going to generate, just pick a number, 8% per year, every year over 30 years compounding going forward. Now they're saying, no, 7.5, 6.75%. Whoop. Every time you reduce this rate, you blow up your unfunded liability. It becomes much bigger because you're now expecting far fewer investment growth, right? Far lower. I highlight that because some of the things put out there by sort of anti-government and particularly anti-union groups, and the Arnold Foundation, key among them in this case, Illinois Policy Institute, are really, they want to use a riskless rate of return as this discount rate, so a T-bill. What does a T-bill bear this day? Is it even a percentage point? What? Think about what that would do. It would blow up this unfunded liability tremendously. Why do they want that? They want to destroy defined benefit systems. And they want the public sector to just move away from them altogether. Blowing up the unfunded liability to untenable situations. We'll do that in most states. Won't do it in Illinois because we have constitutional protections that won't allow that to happen. But we're one of only 3, there might be a 4th state, that have these strong constitutional protections. It's certainly us, New York, and Arizona, and there might be a similar constitutional protection in Alaska, but it's a little grayer. Every other state, pension debt is like any other debt. So when Detroit went bankrupt, the bankruptcy court cut the pension payments that Detroit had to make to its public sector, because it could. In Illinois, first of all, our municipalities can't declare bankruptcy because we haven't passed the enabling legislation. State government can never declare bankruptcy because it's a sovereign entity. But let's say we made the mistake and allowed cities, municipalities, et cetera, the ability to declare bankruptcy, they still couldn't discharge their pension debt. Why? The constitutional guarantee supersedes equitable rights of a bankruptcy court. So a bankruptcy court can't take away a constitutional right. So in our state, it won't work, this plot to make the unfunded liability so big that you make the defined benefit systems go away. In other states, it would work. So that's the biggie. The biggie in here was the decline in the discount rate. It's like 28 billion, 27 billion of the $32 billion growth. It's a big number. 18 billion, that's other factors. Those are basically things the actuaries got wrong. Anybody here a public sector worker, former public sector worker? Show of hands, yeah. So frankly, you're living a lot longer than we want you to. So if you could, if you could start drinking and driving without seatbelts, that would be fantastic, because you could save us a lot of money fiscally. But it's things like that, things the actuaries got wrong.
Don't do your work, do it during your retirement years.
Right, exactly right.
Or you can do it close to your retirement years.
Yeah, that also works. It also helps. That helps quite a
Your
bit.
next to your last year.
Yeah. Investment losses. This is from the Great Recession. Everybody lost money in the Great Recession. If you did well in the Great Recession, please give me tips, because I lost money in the Great Recession. However, if I was making this presentation 3 years ago, that number would be closer to 19 billion. We're earning it back, okay? Because they're taking a long-term diversified portfolio approach to investing in assets. Borrowing from the contribution, so the intentional underfunding of normal costs, 51 billion. And that doesn't include the interest which compounds on that annually. So by far and away, the biggest reason we've grown our unfunded liability is the crazy pension ramp, which just allowed them to hide the structural deficit for 15 years, assuming which they all assumed they'd be out of office, probably other than Madigan, but they all assumed they'd be out of office by the time the ramp ended. He will never die. He only eats like 1 apple a day. The man is the healthiest person alive. Have you seen him? I mean, really, he's healthy. Anyway, so this is how the pension ramp looks going forward. These are the payments. You add the 2 bars together, that's the total payment required by law under the ramp. I broke it down, though, into its component parts. The lighter bar here at the bottom, that's the normal cost of funding benefits. The blue bar, that's the statutory plan for repaying what was borrowed. What do you think is creating the fiscal pressure in Illinois? The cost of benefits or repaying what we borrowed? It's a crazy repayment plan. That is so bad. Look how that grows. I'm good. I'm gonna be a little arrogant here. I'm good at tax policy. I teach a master's course on it at Roosevelt University. I've taught courses on it for the Fulbright Scholar Program. I could design a functional tax system. I cannot design a tax system where the revenue grows like this. I can't do it. It's not possible. This was never intended to be funded. It was always a kick the can down the road, make somebody else deal with the problem. Every solution that's come out of Springfield to date has been focused on reducing benefits. Well, go ahead, cut that for. Go ahead, go fine. What are you going to do about solving the problem? And that's the issue, right? Nothing has actually focused on solving the problem. Now, this next chart, I'm not going to do that one or that one. I will do this one. This is designed to make you all mad. This is a potential solution. So the red line is the current pension ramp. So that's how payments grow from 2021 to 2045. These blue bars are how we would refinance the debt. So the taxpayer payment would change from being that red to this blue. That's how we would change the payments. We would put some more money in up front than what the current ramp requires, and then flatten out the payments. The reason this looks like it's declining, if you remember, the normal cost is declining, but the debt service payment is flat. It's a level dollar. Think about your mortgage. Does your mortgage do this every single year? No. Why? Because you and your bank are sane. What you created was a level dollar payment over a 30-year period. Why did you do that? Because you and your bank knew if you could afford making that payment the first year of the loan, after you got raises and stuff over time and the impact of inflation in real terms, you should definitely be able to afford it the 30th year, right? You don't backload it like that's crazy. So, differences in approach. The current law promises to get the systems 90% funded. If you're curious where we are today, it's 38. We say we can't afford to get 90% funded by the year 2045. It's too expensive. You're going to spend too much money on debt service that you need for current services. Or you're going to have to overtax taxpayers to do that. So we changed the target to 72% funded. You're healthy at 80. So that means this year, 2046, you'd have your normal cost and whatever the amortization would be at a level dollar to go from 72% funded to 80% funded in the next 30 years. But that still much lower cost, right? Because we do this and we put more money in up front, this payment plan costs $45 billion less than the current ramp. We save taxpayers $45 billion. Now, I said I wanted to get you really mad. If we'd have done this 2 years ago, we could have saved taxpayers $67 billion. The magic of compounding interest. Yeah.
Does this assume current population and demographic norms
Yep.
continuing?
Yeah. And when we first proposed doing this, because we were way ahead of the curve, because at CTV we do math. That's kind of what we do. We get excited. And people go woohoo over spreadsheets and stuff. It's a really weird place to work. But we first proposed this, and I'm going to forget the exact year, 05, 06, but somewhere in the aughts. Total taxpayer payment would have been just under $4 billion a year. Think about the savings. Now total taxpayer payment's 12, 3 times. Magic compounding interest. How do you get the additional money? That's a good question. So we suggest that if you don't have tax revenue to cover it, this green part, you issue a pension obligation bond and put all the proceeds in that year to cover the difference. Now, why is that a good thing? And I got to talk about it because, once again, this is something that is so poorly understood, it does make my head want to explode. If you add all those green bars together, we issue about $11 billion in pension obligation bonds over the term of this whole thing, right? Not in any one year, okay? It's a little bit every year. That is not new debt. We already owe this $11 billion to the pensions. Now, instead of owing it to the pensions, it's going to be an asset for the pensions, and we're going to owe it to bondholders. They're going to pay us the $11 billion, and we're going to have to pay them back. Why is that a good thing? Well, number one, it's putting assets into the system that'll generate a return, reducing long-term taxpayer costs. So that helps us save taxpayers this $45 billion. Number two, remember I said the discount rate is both the assumed rate of return on investments, it's also the interest rate that we have to pay on the debt we owe in unfunded liability to our systems. So right now that varies between 6.75 and 7.5%, depending on the pension system. The state of Illinois, even with its lousy credit rating, has been issuing taxable bonds, which these will be, at between 3.8 and 5% interest over the last 2 years. We are going to save substantial money up front on interest costs. We're going to pay less. It's like refinancing your bank mortgage at a lower interest rate. And we've generated an asset that saves us long-term money. It's a win and win. But wait, aren't you gambling with the taxpayers' money? No. So there's the Boston College Center for Retirement Security did a massive study of pension obligation bonds. And the Boston College Center for Retirement Security is not a big fan of them. They don't hate them. They're not a fan of them. The reason they're not a fan of pension obligation bonds is because frequently when governments that are financially stressed issue them, they don't put all the money into the pension system. They spend some of it on current services. Detroit did that. San Diego did that. Rod Blagojevich did that. When Rod Blagojevich, because, right, if it could be done wrong, Rod would search it out and do it. When Rod issued that $10 billion pension obligation bond during his administration, he only put 7.3 into the pension systems. He spent 2.7. So they said, temptation is so big, bonds can be good, but they have to be designed the right way. So we're saying design it the right way, put all the money in. But that said, they studied every pension obligation bond issued in America between 1992 and 2014. The report came out in like 2016, so that was the last year they had final data through. And that's an interesting sequence. So it includes the entire Great Recession. It looked at over 4,500 pension obligation bonds, hundreds of billions of dollars in bonds, many of which were issued the Rod Blagojevich way, the wrong way, or the San Diego way, or the Detroit way, where they siphoned off a significant portion of the bond proceeds for current spending rather than going into systems, right? Despite all that, they had a positive internal rate of return of 1.5%, meaning the interest rate paid to bondholders was 1.5% less than what the assets deposited in the pension system generated in return. And that's with not all the assets going in, and that's with the Great Recession. No, it's not that risky. I'm assuming we're going to have a recession sometime in the next 2 years. People are predicting that. It won't be a Great Recession. Number one. Number two, we have historically low interest rates right now to issue these bonds at. And number three, over 30 years, whatever the impact of this recession is, I'm assuming we'll get over it and we'll have a positive internal rate of return. Number four, that internal rate of return doesn't even include the benefit you get in savings by paying less to bondholders on the debt than you'd be paying to the pension systems. That savings isn't included in the calculation. This is a win for taxpayers. We just need the political will to do it. So you want something to organize around? Light a fire under your elected officials to put pressure on Pritzker to do this. Was that too subtle? All right. Well, at this point, I'm not here to snake oil, right? There's no one magic silver bullet that solves all the state's fiscal problems. They're too big. So we have to do a number of things to get the fiscal house in order. But we, in my opinion, can't just tax our way out of it. I think we're too big of a hole. Refinancing our debt in a rational way, but all this requires is a change in law. We owe the debt to ourselves. There's not a bank or whatever. It's just change the law and put in this payment plan. They could do this legislatively. Anyway. And of course, we need tax increases. So there's my horrified taxpayer. So here's the key about tax policy. I told you I teach a master's class on this. So you're going to get a little bit of that right now, and I apologize. Nerd at heart. But this is one of the truths about fiscal policy. Wherever your needs are greatest, your resources are least. So what does that mean for taxes? They have to be redistributive. You have to raise taxes from people in areas of wealth and spend them in areas of need. Otherwise, the system won't work. You can't tax poor people to give poor people services. Poor people ain't got no money. Okay? So that's just true. It's not socialist. It's not communist. It's math. Okay. But if you do want an ideology, and here I'm going to get ideological on you, let's talk about capitalism, right? And don't read the quote, don't read ahead now. Capitalism was invented by who? Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations. Published in what year? What?
1806.
Close. What did I get over here?
Late 1700s, I thought.
Yes. 1776. America and capitalism born together. Yes. We should all be meat-eating. Remember, I'm an evil corporate lawyer. Yes. It's a good thing. All right. So the guy that invented the system actually had a lot to say about how you tax in a capitalist economy. Here's his quote. I'm going to read it. The subjects of every state ought to contribute toward the support of the government as nearly as possible, in proportion with their respective abilities. That is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state. As Henry Home Lord Keynes has written, a goal of taxation should be to remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. Not Karl Marx. Adam flipping Smith.
But the state constitution makes it impossible to go where the money is.
Right now, we're working on it. So, why did he say this? Why did he say this? And it had everything to do with bargaining power. If you read The Wealth of Nations, and I'm sure you all have, so I'm just going to give you the highlights. He knew that because of the disproportionate advantage owners of capital and wealthy people had in bargaining over laborers, that they would always take a portion of the value laborers contribute to the economy away from laborers and into their pocket through the bargaining process. Always. Not evil or immoral, but how it's going to work when you have disproportionate bargaining power in a capitalist economy. But because of that, the folks at the top of the income ladder would get a disproportionate share of income growth over time, more than the value of their input, more than they deserve, a disproportionate share. So if they were going to get a disproportionate share of income growth, they should have the greatest tax burdens, as a percentage of their income, to pay for the government that in turn protected this economy that lined their pockets. It was a very logical approach. Was he right? We could test it with data. So this is share and income growth in America adjusted for inflation in real terms based on what Americans reported to the IRS on their tax returns from 1947 to 1979, the end of World War II to 1979. The wealthiest 10% after inflation got 34% of all the growth in income. The bottom 90% got 66%. Okay, disproportionate return to the top, sure, but capitalism was working. A rising tide was lifting all boats. And in fact, it didn't matter how you cut the income data. Every cohort of earner, was seeing real growth in income every single year, which means real improvement in purchasing power, real improvement in standard of living every year. Well, from 1979 to 2015, after inflation, the wealthiest 10% got 108% of all the growth in income in America. So if you hate math, I will point out 100% would be all of it. So if more than all the growth in income went to the wealthiest 10%, that means 90% of our country after inflation was earning less at the end of this sequence than they had before. So Adam probably would have predicted this. He never would have predicted that. But this is the reality. So you need a tax system that recognizes that reality and does what Adam Smith says is fair, and the way to raise revenue and focus your taxes up here. If you don't focus your tax collection up here, you will have a structural deficit, because you're not going to be generating your tax revenue where the economy is growing. You're going to be generating it where it's declining after inflation over time. That leads to a gap between your cost growth and your revenue growth. In purely fiscal terms, it's idiotic. From a fairness standpoint, it also makes no sense. How are we doing in Illinois? I thought I would take out the wealthiest 1%. This is the wealthiest 1% in Illinois, and their growth in income from 1979 through 2015. And if you did the math, it grew by 177%. This is the bottom 99%. So this includes the rest of the top 10% that had real income growth, right? Total income growth, 9%. Where do you think we should be focusing taxes? Okay. If you have that kind of discrepancy in income growth over time, you're going to have discrepancy in wealth. So this is just U.S. Census data. You could run these numbers yourself if you so are inclined. Just go to the far right-hand column there. The wealthiest 10% in America now own 77% of America's wealth. The wealthiest 3% own over 50% of America's wealth. So yeah, you want your tax system to respond to the modern economy. There's the modern economy. Illinois, I think the point you're making, has a constitution that requires a flat income tax. That actually prohibits us from doing what Adam Smith says. Why? No other tax besides the income tax can actually be designed to correspond to ability to pay. Every other tax is regressive. Sales taxes, excise taxes, property taxes, every other one of them will take a greater share of income from a lower moderate earner than from a wealthier earner. Income tax is the only one that can have lower rates on lower levels of income and higher rates on higher income levels of income. It's the only one. But our Constitution says no. So that's why it's important to support this resolution. This is how tax burden is given out in Illinois now, assessed in Illinois now, without having a graduated rate tax system with a flat tax. You see the bottom 20, 40, 60, 80% all pay a greater percentage of their income in state and local taxes than do the wealthy, this 1%. Just the opposite of what Adam Smith said you should have. Adam Smith argued for progressive taxation. This is highly regressive taxation. And just to sort of rub salt in the wounds, I'll just go to the one chart. We make income inequality in Illinois worse with our taxes. So this is comparing the income of the wealthiest 1% in our state to the bottom 20%. Before taxes, the wealthiest 1% in our state have incomes that are 137 times greater than the average person in the bottom 20%. After taxes in Illinois, it goes up. Their income is 149 times greater because our tax burden is regressive. We worsen income inequality by having a regressive tax system. I can't defend that any way at all, especially when there's no growth in income for 90% of our state. Our numbers for the bottom 90% track the national. So what was the proposal? So there's two proposals. We've got to keep this separate. One is the constitutional amendment that will come up for ratification. All that does is it modifies the Illinois Constitution to take the requirement that the income tax be a flat tax. It just permits a graduated rate structure. Does not say what that structure should be. The General Assembly passed and Governor Pritzker signed a bill that says if voters ratify this amendment, this is what our tax structure will be beginning the following January. So we know what the tax rates will be. This is your taxable income after deductions and credits, single filers, married filing jointly. This is the tax rates that apply to the increments of income. So our current flat tax rate is 4.95% that applies to all income, right? Everyone, when I say everyone, there's one exception. I'll get to the exception at the end. So when you hear everyone except the one exception. That's what you need to hear. Everyone will pay a lower rate on their first $10,000 of income, a 4.75% rate than our current rate. Then everyone will pay a lower rate on the next $90,000 of income up to 100, lower rate. Then between $100,000 and $250,000 of taxable income, everyone pays the flat rate that we currently have of 4.95%. And then when you get over $250,000 of income, the rates start ratcheting up. The exceptions, these folks. So if you are single and you have $750,000 of taxable income or more, or you're married and filing jointly and you have $1 million of taxable income or more, you go from paying a flat rate of 4.95% on all your taxable income to a flat rate of 7.99%. You don't get any of the advantage of the graduated structure underneath. Yeah.
Am I reading it correctly from back here? The first four rows, married and joint, are the same? So
Yes.
a husband and a person who makes 100,000 and a couple who makes 100,000 are going to pay the same taxes.
Yep, like they do now. Like they do now. Except they're going to pay it at a lower rate. But it's like they do now. Okay?
Yeah, Ralph, just a heads up, the library closes at 9, so we've got.
Okay. Well, we're done. So the rate works. It cuts taxes for 97% of taxpayers, raises $3.6 billion in new revenue. Our new rate is well within national norms of other states with rates, except it kicks in at a much higher rate of income, or top rate, than the highest rate in other states. And, well, this is tax burden as a percentage of income, the red line under current law, so the bottom 20% pay 14% of their income. And under the new law, it goes to the blue line. So you can see it's a very small tax cut for most people. And it's a tax increase for the wealthy. So I don't want anyone thinking that you're going to make tons in your tax cut. The reason you don't get a big tax, you get a tax cut. 97% of the state will pay less. But you don't get a huge tax cut because the state is broke. They need money. So that's why. But still, the math does work. And it won't wreck the economy. So there's never been really peer-reviewed studies that find that it does. This is my favorite. 41 states in America have a tax, an income tax, 9 do not. So this compares over the last decade economic growth in the 9 states with no income tax at all. They're in the red, and they include the miracle economic states of Texas, Florida, Nevada, North Dakota, all these places we wish we could be. And the 9 states in America that not only have an income tax, but have a graduated structure and the highest tax rates. So Connecticut, California, New York, Minnesota, Massachusetts, those places. GDP growth per capita, 2.9% in the no tax states, 9.7% in the high tax states. You see personal income better in the high tax states, disposable personal income better, personal consumption better. So what does this do? What does this say and what doesn't it say? And I'm just going to be very clear. This doesn't say you tax yourself to prosperity. It never makes such a claim. That's an idiotic thing to say. But it does say those people that say you just increase your income taxes on the wealthy or you go to a graduated rate income tax, you'll ruin your economy. No, it's just not true. And I'm sure that they can pull out data points that show the no-tax states are ahead of the high-tax states in other areas, and fine with that, because that just supports my point. There's no statistically meaningful correlation between tax policy and your economy. Other things matter more. So when it comes to your tax policy, just get it right and have it work in the modern economy. So there you go. There's two of the solutions we need. I could talk about the other two, but we don't have time. Any other questions? Great. Let's go. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ron.
Yeah, no, I'm done.